Imagine living in a world with no central heating, no electric blankets, and no insulated walls. Just bitter winds, icy nights, and the constant threat of freezing to death. That was the harsh reality for medieval peasants. Yet, somehow, they endured. In this video, we're diving deep into the forgotten wisdom and survival strategies that helped the poorest people of the Middle Ages survive the coldest nights of the year. Winter in medieval Europe was an unforgiving season, and for peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, it was a time not just of hardship, but of genuine danger. The idea of winter as a cozy, festive time didn't exist for them. Instead, it marked a long, grueling battle against the cold, with very limited resources. Snowfall might have looked beautiful from a distance, but for a peasant family living in a poorly insulated cottage, it often meant another sleepless night spent shivering, and another day spent wondering whether the food or firewood would last. Most peasant homes were built with the simplest and cheapest materials available: wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, and dirt floors. These structures were not designed for comfort. They were built for survival, and even that was pushing it. The walls were often thin, and wind would whistle through the gaps. There was no insulation, no double-glazed windows, and no chimney in the way we think of it today. Instead, smoke from the central fire would fill the room and escape through a hole in the roof, sometimes helping warm the space slightly, but also causing breathing issues. Still, this was a small price to pay if it meant staying alive through the night. In regions like England, France, and Germany, temperatures could drop well below freezing during the harshest months, especially from December to February. For peasants living in the countryside, there was no such thing as a snowplow or a heated town center. Roads became impassable, water froze over, and daily tasks like fetching firewood or collecting water became dangerous undertakings. Every winter, families braced themselves for illness, hunger, and frostbite. Death from exposure was not uncommon, especially among the elderly or very young. The harsh climate was made worse by the unpredictability of medieval weather patterns. Some winters were mild, but others, like during the Little Ice Age that began in the late Middle Ages, were devastating. Crops would fail, food shortages would spike, and freezing temperatures could linger for months. Without a reliable food supply, the body weakened, and once your strength was gone, the cold claimed its victims more easily. The cold also brought an eerie stillness to peasant life. Fields lay dormant under a blanket of snow, tools were set aside, and animals were kept close to the home for warmth and protection. Days were shorter, and darkness arrived early. Time was marked by candlelight and firelight, as the sun disappeared before many chores could even be completed. It was during these months that many would fall into a kind of seasonal depression, though they didn't have a name for it back then. The lack of sunlight, fresh food, and warmth took a toll on both body and spirit. And yet, despite these brutal conditions, medieval peasants endured. Their survival was not the result of modern convenience, but of communal knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which materials helped block the wind, how to conserve heat with minimal fuel, and how to prepare their homes and bodies for months of bitter cold. It was a fragile existence, but it was one rooted in resourcefulness, determination, and the unbreakable will to live, even in the face of nature's harshest tests. At the center of every medieval peasant's home stood the hearth, a crude but essential fireplace that was far more than just a place to cook food. It was the beating heart of the household, the one defense against the icy grasp of winter. Without it, survival through the coldest nights would have been nearly impossible. Fire meant life, and for medieval peasants, keeping that fire alive was a sacred, almost obsessive duty. The hearth was typically a simple fire pit, either set directly on the earthen floor or raised slightly with stones. Most peasant cottages lacked chimneys in the way we think of them today. Instead, smoke would drift upward through a hole in the thatched roof or seep out through loose sections of wall. While this often led to smoky, uncomfortable conditions indoors, the smoke also served a dual purpose. It helped to preserve wooden beams by discouraging rot and insects, and it offered a form of insulation by creating a layer of warm air near the ceiling. Lighting a fire from scratch was a difficult and time-consuming task, especially in damp winter conditions. That's why letting the fire die was considered a dangerous mistake. Peasants learned clever techniques to preserve embers overnight. One common method involved burying hot coals or stones under a thick layer of ashes before going to sleep. This insulation would keep the embers smoldering until morning, when a few gentle breaths and a bit of kindling could bring the fire roaring back to life. Losing the fire meant losing hours of precious time the next morning, and possibly enduring a morning chill so bitter it could freeze water in a bucket left indoors. The fire didn't just warm the room, it was the centerpiece of all domestic activity. Meals were prepared over it, often as stews or porridges that could simmer for hours while maximizing warmth and nutrition. Pots would hang from iron hooks or rest on stones around the fire. Even basic tasks like boiling water, drying clothes, or heating herbal remedies all depended on it. When the days grew shorter and colder, people naturally gathered around the fire not just for warmth, but for a sense of shared humanity. It was where stories were told, prayers were whispered, and silent reflections took place as flames flickered in the darkness. But firewood wasn't always easy to come by. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially near forests controlled by the nobility, peasants were restricted in the amount of wood they could legally gather. Poaching timber or collecting fallen branches from noble lands could result in harsh punishment. As a result, peasants learned to make the most of what they had. Dried animal dung, peat, and even bundles of tightly packed straw were used as makeshift fuel when wood was scarce. These alternatives produced less heat and a terrible smell, but any fire was better than none when frost covered the walls. During the coldest nights, entire families would sleep close to the hearth, sometimes on the hard floor, with only animal skins or straw for bedding. Proximity to the fire meant a better chance at staying warm, especially when temperatures outside could kill an unprotected person in a matter of hours. Children, the elderly, and the sick were often given the warmest spots, closest to the heat, farthest from the drafty walls. The fire also brought with it a powerful psychological comfort. When the wind howled outside and darkness pressed against the thin walls of the cottage, the glow of the hearth offered a small, flickering promise that dawn would come. It was a symbol of resilience, a constant reminder that as long as the fire burned, there was still hope, still life. In many ways, medieval peasants measured the quality of their nights not by luxury or ease, but by the strength and endurance of their fire. A well-tended hearth could mean survival, warmth, and a shared moment of peace. In the midst of so much cold and hardship, it was this small flame that kept the human spirit alive. In an age without modern textiles, synthetic fabrics, or central heating, medieval peasants had to rely on natural materials and clever layering to protect themselves from the bitter cold. Their most trusted ally in this constant battle against the freezing weather was wool, a coarse, itchy, but incredibly effective material that played a central role in their everyday survival. Clothing wasn't about fashion or self-expression. It was about creating a barrier between the fragile human body and a world that seemed determined to freeze it solid. From the moment the first chill of autumn touched the air, peasants began to wrap themselves in every piece of fabric they could find. Layering was essential. A single layer of clothing offered little resistance to the wind and cold, but multiple layers, each trapping a small pocket of warm air, could make a world of difference. Undergarments were made from linen when available, while outer garments were thick, heavy, and woolen. A tunic might be worn over a shirt, and a cloak or mantle would be draped over everything else, fastened with a simple brooch or tied with a piece of cord. Wool was so prized not only because of its warmth, but also because of its availability. Most villages had access to sheep, and spinning wool into yarn was a skill passed down through generations. While wealthy individuals could afford finely woven fabrics, peasants often wore rough-spun, homemade wool that itched the skin and retained moisture, but it still did the job. Even when damp, wool provided insulation, making it far superior to other natural fibers like cotton or flax, which offered little warmth in cold conditions. Cloaks were particularly important during winter. These large, heavy garments could be wrapped tightly around the body and even pulled over the head at night, like a blanket. Some were hooded for extra warmth, protecting the neck and ears from biting winds. Gloves were rare among peasants, but sleeves were often extended to cover the hands, and mittens, when available, were crudely made from scraps of wool or animal skin. Footwear was even more basic. Leather shoes, if owned at all, were often stuffed with straw or wool rags to create a primitive form of insulation. Many peasants simply wrapped their feet in cloth and wore wooden clogs over them to avoid direct contact with the frozen ground. Head coverings were another vital piece of the winter survival puzzle. Much of the body's heat escapes through the head, so peasants wore woolen caps or hoods, sometimes even wrapping scarves or extra fabric around their heads and necks. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable to cold, so families often sacrificed their best pieces of warm clothing to protect them. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to sleep fully dressed, wearing every layer they owned just to preserve body heat through the night. But clothing alone wasn't always enough. On the coldest nights, when even wool couldn't fully stop the chill, peasants resorted to adding natural insulation. Straw and hay were more than just animal bedding. They were essential winter tools. Peasants would lay down thick piles of straw on the floor and sleep on top of it, covered by cloaks, woolen sheets, or animal hides. Some even tucked straw beneath their clothing to provide extra warmth during the night or while working outdoors. The straw acted like a primitive mattress and blanket in one, helping to conserve precious body heat. Animal hides and fur were also used when available, though they were more common among wealthier households. A well-preserved sheepskin could serve as a makeshift coat or blanket. Peasants who were fortunate enough to own or trap animals would save the pelts for the cold season, layering them over straw bedding or sewing them into patchwork winter garments. Despite their ingenuity, peasant clothing was still incredibly uncomfortable by modern standards. The fabrics were heavy and stiff, making movement awkward. Washing clothes in winter was also a challenge. Icy water and freezing temperatures made it impractical, so garments were often worn for weeks or even months without washing. The combination of sweat, smoke, and dampness created an unpleasant odor that became part of daily life. Still, these rough clothes served their purpose. They weren't beautiful, and they certainly weren't comfortable, but they allowed peasants to carry on with their work, tending animals, gathering firewood, and walking long distances in the cold, all without succumbing to the deadly grip of hypothermia. Layer by layer, peasants built a wearable shield against the elements. It was not a perfect system, but it was born of necessity and refined through generations of hardship. In a world where one night of unprotected exposure could mean death, even a scratchy wool tunic could be the difference between life and a silent, frozen end. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a collective one. Nowhere was this more evident than in the way peasants approached sleep during the harshest winter months. For them, the night was not a private retreat, but a shared effort to endure the cold. The concept of individual bedrooms or personal space was completely foreign to peasant families. Instead, they relied on the oldest and most effective heating system known to humankind, each other's bodies. Inside a typical peasant cottage, space was extremely limited. Most homes consisted of a single room where all activities, cooking, eating, working, and sleeping, took place. In winter, this tight living space became a strategic advantage. Heat, generated by people and animals alike, was more easily trapped in a small area with low ceilings and few windows. These humble homes were drafty, but crowding together helped mitigate the effects of the cold. At bedtime, the family would gather close to the hearth if possible, arranging themselves in tight groups on straw bedding, mats, or directly on the dirt floor. They slept in all their clothing, often still wearing cloaks and hoods, with children nestled between parents and elders, placed near the center of the group to receive the most warmth. Infants and toddlers were sometimes swaddled tightly and placed beneath multiple layers of fabric and straw. Sleeping arrangements weren't made for comfort, they were made for survival. Sleeping together in this way was not only practical, but necessary. On especially frigid nights, the combined body heat of several people could raise the immediate temperature around them by a few critical degrees. That small increase often meant the difference between rest and freezing. Some families even developed sleeping rituals, not out of luxury, but to maintain warmth, positioning limbs in certain ways, keeping shared blankets taut, or even waking periodically during the night to stoke the fire or adjust sleeping arrangements. But it wasn't always just the family that shared this space. Animals were also brought indoors during the winter, not only to protect them from the elements, but to add precious warmth to the home. Chickens might roost in corners, goats and pigs might be tethered near the walls, and in some cases, cows or oxen could be housed in a partitioned section of the same room. The body heat from these animals contributed to the overall temperature, and their breathing and movements provided a kind of ambient life that helped keep the space from falling into icy stillness. This blurring of lines between human and animal, between sleep and survival, highlights just how different medieval life was from ours. The smell, noise, and mess would be unbearable to modern sensibilities, but for medieval peasants, it was a routine part of winter life. The closeness wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Sharing warmth created a sense of community, a bond forged not in comfort, but in endurance. In the long dark months of winter, when food was scarce and the days were short, this unity provided emotional strength. In larger households, or in homes with extended families, sleeping arrangements might resemble a crowded encampment. Grandparents, parents, children, cousins, everyone shared the same space. It was a practice passed down through generations, and in many ways, it mirrored the social structure of peasant life itself: communal, cooperative, and centered on survival. If one person in the group became ill or died, it had repercussions for everyone. That interdependence was never clearer than during the long, cold nights, when even a single warm body could be a vital resource. Occasionally, heated bricks or stones, warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth, were added to beds to provide some measure of comfort. These makeshift heaters didn't last long, but they offered temporary relief, especially in the moments just before falling asleep. Some families even sang songs or recited prayers together before bed, not only to foster a sense of calm and unity, but also to mark the end of another day survived in the depths of winter. Interestingly, this shared sleeping practice also helped to conserve resources. Instead of heating multiple rooms or maintaining multiple fires, one central hearth and one sleeping area were enough. The body heat generated by a group of people could reduce the amount of firewood needed to keep the home from freezing, a critical concern during long winters when wood supplies were limited and gathering more meant venturing into dangerous, icy terrain. These sleeping arrangements were not ideal, and they certainly did not offer comfort in the way we understand it today. But in the absence of insulation, electricity, or modern bedding, the medieval peasant solution was rooted in practicality and deep communal wisdom. They survived by sticking together, literally. In an environment where isolation could be deadly, warmth became a shared burden, and the simple act of sleeping beside another person became a life-saving act. Even in the face of such hardship, there was something deeply human about it. The nightly ritual of gathering together, wrapping up in cloaks and straw, listening to the crackle of the fire and the breathing of loved ones, created a rhythm, a shared heartbeat in the darkness of winter. It was not luxurious, but it was enough to keep them alive, night after night, until the thaw finally came. The secret to surviving a medieval winter wasn't discovered in the moment. It was prepared for in the months before the first frost ever touched the ground. For peasants, the coldest nights of the year were not sudden surprises, but long-anticipated challenges that required planning, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of nature's cycles. The winter was a test of preparation as much as endurance, and those who failed to plan ahead often didn't survive to see the spring. From the end of summer into early autumn, every able-bodied person in a peasant household was involved in gathering, preserving, and stockpiling. There was no refrigeration, no supermarkets, and certainly no emergency heating systems. What they managed to store during the warmer months would be all they had to rely on once the snow came. Every task was done with winter in mind. Harvesting wasn't just about gathering what was ripe, it was about selecting which crops could be stored, which grains would keep longest, and which vegetables could survive the months ahead. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and cabbages were staples because they lasted longer and could be stored in cool, dry places such as cellars or dugout storage pits. Food preservation was an art. Meats were salted or smoked, techniques that could keep them edible for weeks or months. Salting involved coating meat or fish in large amounts of salt to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth. Smoking, though requiring time and access to firewood, added another layer of preservation, and it allowed even tough cuts of meat to be consumed long after they'd otherwise spoil. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were kept dry and stored in sacks or bins, protected from rodents and moisture. Bread, the cornerstone of the peasant diet, was often baked in large batches and hardened over time, to be eaten slowly and softened in soups or water when needed. Herbs were dried and stored for both culinary and medicinal use. Garlic, leeks, and horseradish were treasured not only for their flavor, but for their perceived ability to fight illness during the winter months. Peasants couldn't rely on doctors, and so every household had a basic understanding of healing herbs and home remedies, many of which were used to treat colds, fevers, and frostbite. Honey, when available, served as both a sweetener and a wound treatment. Everything had to serve more than one purpose. Waste was not an option, but perhaps just as crucial as food was fuel. Firewood had to be gathered in enormous quantities before winter set in. This was backbreaking labor that required days, if not weeks, of chopping, hauling, and stacking. Wet wood was almost useless. It had to be seasoned, left to dry so it would burn efficiently and provide the most heat. In forested regions, peasants were often restricted from cutting trees by laws protecting noble lands, which meant they had to rely on fallen branches, dead wood, or scraps. In treeless areas, the burden was even greater. They collected peat from bogs, dried dung from livestock, and anything else that could be set alight. Fuel was as precious as food, and conserving it became a matter of daily strategy. Peasants also made practical modifications to their homes as winter approached. Cracks in the walls were filled with mud or straw. Thatched roofs were patched and reinforced to prevent leaks and retain heat. Sometimes, small windows were covered with oiled cloth or animal bladders to keep out the wind while still letting in light. These materials acted as primitive insulation, reducing drafts and maintaining what little warmth the central hearth could generate. The interior of the home was rearranged for winter efficiency. Sleeping areas were moved closer to the hearth. Tools and supplies were brought indoors to protect them from freezing or theft. Any remaining space was tightly packed with essentials: baskets of food, bundles of firewood, sacks of grain. The household became a carefully organized bunker against the season, with every object serving a vital role. Animal care was another critical piece of winter preparation. Livestock were more than just food. They were warmth, labor, and livelihood. Cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens were brought into enclosed areas or even housed within the same building as the family. Not only did this protect them from the elements, but it helped retain body heat in the home. Feed had to be gathered and stored for months, and pens had to be cleaned and reinforced to handle the snow and cold. Losing a single animal during the winter could mean the loss of milk, meat, wool, or income for an entire year. Daily routines during winter were reduced to essentials. With shorter days and limited resources, peasants focused only on tasks that ensured survival. They mended clothing, sharpened tools, and prepared whatever food was available. Travel was rare and dangerous. Most people remained close to home, relying on what they had stored and on their own ingenuity to make it last. When sickness struck, and it often did, families turned inward, relying on herbal remedies, religious faith, and the healing power of time. Winter also had spiritual dimensions for the medieval peasant. The dark season was associated with trial, patience and reflection. The church calendar was filled with holy days and saints' feasts that brought moments of light into the gloom. Religious rituals, fasting, and prayers were part of the rhythm of winter life, offering both structure and hope. Even in the coldest, hardest moments, faith gave people the strength to endure. Ultimately, the peasant's survival in winter was not due to luck, nor the kindness of nature. It was earned through discipline, sacrifice, and centuries of hard-won knowledge. Every sack of grain, every bundle of firewood, every layer of straw beneath a sleeping body was a silent testimony to the foresight and resilience of people who had no choice but to endure. Their lives were fragile, their comforts few, but they were never without a plan, and it was that plan, passed from one frozen generation to the next, that kept the fire burning through even the coldest nights.